Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, under the terms of the ceasefire agreement, tens of thousands of displaced residents of northern Gaza start returning home. But in many cases, they're returning to rubble and apocalyptic scenes of devastation. Egypt, Jordan, the EU and the Arab League express firm opposition to suggestions by President Trump that Palestinians from Gaza be expelled and resettled in neighbouring countries. And Lindsey Graham, a key Republican ally of President Trump, expresses concerns about pardons being issued to the January 6th rioters who attacked police officers. Coming up, we'll be speaking to two people with starkly different views, both pardoned by the president. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin in Gaza, where hundreds of thousands of people are reported to have been making their way home on foot. This after a deal was reached between Israel and Hamas for the release of another 6 hostages. Well, this part of the deal had been stalled after Israel accused Hamas of violating the terms of the truce. Well, the majority of Gaza's 2 million residents have been displaced during these past 15 months of war, which has reduced much of Gaza to rubble. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Shaina, spokesperson for the Norwegian Refugee Council, who joins us from the Jordanian capital, Amman. Thank you so much for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News, Shaina. We're being told that 200,000 displaced people have returned on foot to the north of Gaza during the course of the last few hours. What sort of things, what sort of a scene are they finding on arrival, Shaina?
Well, I just spoke, Tom, about an hour ago to one of our colleagues who remained in Gaza City throughout the last 15 months and asked her to describe the scene. And she told me it's raining people and that she had a hard time crossing the street because it was so crowded. So she told me that it was scenes of happiness. Of course, people are devastated to see the amount of destruction. There's tremendous rubble and destruction throughout all of northern Gaza, Gaza City, and the North Gaza Governorate. But people are relieved to be coming home. They plan to set up shelters on the rubble of their old homes, but they're happy to be back on their property, at their homes. And I think today was really a day full of both joyous reunions and also grief of understanding just how much was lost and how many people have been lost over the last 15 months.
Yeah, I mean, the scenes we've been seeing make it look like it's an earthquake zone, and clearly a massive reconstruction effort is going to be needed. But until that happens, I mean, where and how are people going to live there?
Well, first of all, we need to get temporary shelter solutions into Gaza. Right now, the only aid that's able to reach the northern part of Gaza is coming via Jordan and the Jordan corridor. So for many humanitarian agencies that had focused on bringing in aid via Egypt and Kerem Shalom, we're having to work to reroute our aid and make sure that we're getting aid there. There are some immediate concerns around the safety of people. One, around explosive remnants of war, unexploded ordnances, and the fact that people may be returning to places where there are risks of being killed due to bombing, basically the leftovers of bombs. And we've already heard a couple of instances where people have been killed. So we need to be working on education and making sure that when people return home, they know how to do so safely. There are also concerns around buildings that may still be standing that are damaged but are actually structurally unsound. So we're going to have to be conducting assessments, setting up temporary shelters for people who are returning to their properties, making sure that they have tents and the materials that they need to build temporary shelters until the rubble is removed, safely removed, and reconstruction can start in full.
Yeah, we're reading reports about some areas with 75% destruction to homes and infrastructure, more than 75% in some cases. I'm just wondering if it's very much like that across the board, or whether there are some areas of the north of Gaza that are much worse affected than others.
Well, all throughout Gaza, an estimated 90% of housing units are damaged or destroyed. And of course, that's varying degrees of damage. It could be entire walls missing or a window broken. But there's a tremendous amount of rebuilding that needs to be done. In terms of the most severe areas, by far, that's the North Gaza Governorate. And we've heard reports of people who have returned up to North Gaza and on foot last week when the ceasefire first took hold, who left Gaza City and returned to their homes and found that there was so little there that they decided to come back to Gaza City. We ourselves had a staff member who had went to return to her home and saw the level of destruction. And also the level of infrastructure that's been destroyed in that area makes it very difficult for aid trucks to even reach those places and find the thousands of people who remained over the 100+ day siege that Israel imposed on the northernmost governorate of Gaza, and deliver essentials, because the roads are impassable and reconstruction needs to be done to ensure that trucks can actually make their way there.
I'm just trying to imagine what the immediate needs are, but I'm assuming it's things like fuel, food, medicine. I mean, what are the main needs at this particular moment in those worst affected areas?
Well, I think we have to be recognized that just because the bombs have stopped falling does not mean that the emergency or the crisis has ended. It just means that we finally have an operating environment where we can scale up and surge our supplies. And so the basic essentials are still what's needed: food, water, medicine, essential shelter items, and of course fuel, because that's needed to, one, power the trucks, the machinery to remove the rubble, the bakeries. And that's one of the most important things, which has really struggled to get up to the northern parts of Gaza. We've heard of one convoy that's made it there since the ceasefire went into effect, and we're continuing to push to allow more fuel trucks to enter North Gaza and Gaza City directly to be able to power those bakeries, those generators at hospitals, and the machinery that's needed to fuel the response.
So how would you describe the humanitarian situation in the north of Gaza? What sort of words could one use?
I mean, it's a hellscape. It's the amount of destruction is just unimaginable. I mean, we see the images, but we think about that in terms of not only the structures themselves, but also the memories that have been lost, the people who are still buried under the rubble. It's going to take not weeks, months, but years in order for us to be able to really remove all of this rubble, ensure that the UN itself has estimated that it will take 14 years just to demine all of Gaza at this point and remove all of the explosive remnants of war. And so it's a level of destruction unlike we've ever seen in the occupied Palestinian territory. And for sure, this is a years-long recovery and reconstruction process.
But in terms of managing the crisis, is it easier for an NGO like yours or for other aid organizations to manage the crisis when people are in camps? Because obviously they're then more concentrated. Distribution presumably is easier, isn't it, when people are all in the same place than when they're scattered more broadly?
I think it's hard to know which is preferable, because also we have to remember that the camps and the informal sites that displaced Palestinians have been living in are incredibly overcrowded. There's challenges in getting aid to those areas because of how tightly packed they were, difficulty in installing sanitation facilities. And so in some ways, having people more spread out gives people a little bit more space, a little bit more dignity. Of course, one of the challenges, as we've witnessed, as you said, 200,000 people moving today alone. And with this mass movement, it means that as humanitarian agencies, we need to be really agile in terms of identifying needs and ensuring that we're meeting people where they are and providing what they need where they are. And I think in terms of people's psychological well-being, of course, being back where their homes were, even if their homes are not standing, is a relief. Being back with other members of their community is something that's going to tie people together and in some ways hopefully mitigate some of the internal tensions that of course you get with lots of people living in a very enclosed small space with limited resources.
Yeah, you mentioned people's mental well-being. Clearly, a lot of people must be really traumatized. I mean, I'm thinking particularly about children, having seen 15 months of deadly violence right under their noses.
Yeah, we have been working in Gaza for 15 years, providing psychosocial support to students. And of course, there have been multiple escalations in those 15 years, but we've never seen anything as devastating as this in terms of how widespread the devastation and destruction is and the amount of grief and trauma. We have an entire society that is traumatized, and we need to ensure that our response is trauma informed and that we're not just providing the basic essentials of food, water, and medicine, but we're providing Palestinians with the tools and the psychosocial support that they need in order to restart their lives.
Just talking about some of the more vulnerable people who've been living in camps for much of the last 15 months. Is it advisable for some people, I'm thinking about elderly people, people who might be disabled in one way or another, to stay in the camps where perhaps they have more immediate access to the support they need?
That certainly is something that we're looking at. We sent out some of our teams this week to go and look at the sites and look at the people who are most vulnerable or might have difficulty moving as everyone else is moving. Of course, most people are returning to Gaza, to northern Gaza on foot. And so for people who have disabilities or elderly or maybe even have small children, that can be quite difficult. And so we're assessing to see how those people can be met. But I think it's also important to remember that so much of Palestinian society is based around the extended family unit, based around community. And so we want to make sure that those people are not, if they are left behind, at least for now, that they aren't isolated and that they're given the support that they need.
We were just talking about the scale of the damage a little earlier on. According to some satellite images, it appears that 2/3, maybe 70%, as we were saying, of the territory has been severely damaged. And I'm just wondering, for people who return to their homes, we've been talking about how people are happy to be back home, even if it's the site of a former home. Some are suggesting perhaps they might not want to stay there for all that much longer, and the idea of being resettled somewhere else might gain appeal as time goes by. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we all saw the announcement this weekend from President Trump saying that he felt that some other Arab countries should take Palestinians in. We already have a 75-year-long refugee crisis, and we need to ensure that Palestinians are not being forcibly displaced or displaced, which is in violation of international law and their right, in order to under the guise of humanitarian relief or what's best for them. Palestinians themselves know what is best for them, and they should be the ones to determine what their future looks like. And we need to support them wherever they are in determining what that future is.
And of course, you're in the Jordanian capital, Amman, and Jordan is one of the countries that President Trump has suggested people from Gaza be resettled in. I mean, how did those comments go down in Jordan, do you think?
I think that they were pretty unacceptable. Jordan already hosts an enormous Palestinian refugee population of Palestinians that were displaced both in 1948 and again in 1967. And while the Jordanian government has been extremely generous and accommodating to Palestinians living in Jordan and also providing humanitarian relief to those in Gaza, I don't think that they have an issue an interest in hosting more refugees. They also have hosted refugees from Iraq and Syria as well. And so I think it's a non-starter here.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Shaina Lowe, thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Now, the US President Donald Trump has suggested that Egypt and Jordan could take in Palestinians from Gaza. Well, during the course of the weekend, the president told reporters that it was, quote, time to clean out Gaza. Well, both Hamas and the Palestinians have condemned that proposal, and Jordan and Egypt have flatly rejected the idea. Well, Jordan is currently home to more than 2 million Palestinian refugees, whilst tens of thousands of others live in Egypt. Well, for more, we can speak now to Fred Fleitz, who's the Chief of Staff and Executive Secretary of the National Security Council during the first Trump administration, who joins us now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'd just like to start by asking you, I mean, how widely shared is the view in Washington that Palestinians should leave Gaza and be resettled in other countries?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I think the question is, do Americans think that Donald Trump is serious about this? And I believe he is. We're seeing him taking on international problems with unconventional approaches that have not been heard before. And I would say that to look at this proposal, the most important thing is to recognize that Donald Trump is rejecting the idea of the two-state solution and letting the Palestinians rule Gaza for the foreseeable future until they're de-radicalized. I think this is an opening position that Trump feels very strongly about. It is basically throwing out the position of the Biden administration, which kept pushing a two-state solution over the objections of the Israeli government. So I think Trump is reframing this, and I wouldn't underestimate him.
Some of the unconventional methods adopted by Donald Trump are viewed as being negotiating tactics by some analysts. Could this be a negotiating tactic?
I'm not going to say that. I'm simply going to say that he is a deal maker. He's serious, and he's been delivering on the things that he's been promising. And he has a very competent national security team with him, with Michael Waltz as national security advisor, Marco Rubio. He now has multiple envoys who are working in the Middle East. Trump is very dedicated to bringing stability to the Middle East and standing by our friends and allies.
Speaking of friends and allies, Jordan and Egypt are two friends and allies of the United States. We heard the president on Air Force One saying you're talking about probably 1.5 million people. We just clean out that whole thing. Obviously, that went down very well with Israel's far right, and we can talk about that in a minute. But how do you think it went down with Washington's other allies in the region, notably the two countries most concerned by that idea, Egypt and Jordan?
Well, look, Egypt and Jordan have always taken a position that they don't want to take Palestinian refugees, and that was an expected response by both nations. But I also think Egypt and Jordan and other nations are looking at Trump, and they're seeing him achieving things that didn't appear to be possible just a few years ago. So we will see what happens. Trump has a very aggressive peace effort plan for the Ukraine war. He's talked about buying Greenland, ending Chinese domination over the Panama Canal. So this is part of an approach of breaking the norms of American foreign policy and seeing what's possible.
The Arab League is a dominant and important voice in this region. They said that such a move, resettling Palestinians elsewhere, would be tantamount to, quote, ethnic cleansing, their words, not mine. I mean, Middle Eastern allies in the United States, in the Middle East, are sounding extremely clear about this. They simply don't like this idea, firmly opposed to it.
I think if you were to put many Arab leaders in a room privately, they'd say to you, they're outraged at the genocidal attack by Hamas terrorists against Israel on October 7th, 2023. That's the mess that was caused by Hamas. Now, Trump is proposing a solution to this mess, to this instability. But if we're going to talk about ethnic cleansing and genocide, let's start with Hamas. Let's start with a terrorist group that is still holding innocent Israeli hostages almost 2 years after they launched their genocidal attack.
Donald Trump talked about Gaza as being what he called a demolition site. He said something has to happen. I mean, could we read into that perhaps the US has got some plans to help with the reconstruction of Gaza?
I don't know what else to add on what I've already told you. I think it's part of a strategy to reset the parameters of this debate, and we'll see what Steve Witkoff and other envoys have in mind.
Are you surprised by the reaction of other countries to this idea? I mean, or do you think that was to be entirely expected?
Look, I could have told you how Egypt and Jordan would respond to this, and I know why they responded to this. You and I know that Palestinian terrorists assassinated the Jordanian king's grandfather. And Jordan remembers that. Both nations have security concerns about, Palestinian terrorists and terrorist groups, not just Hamas, but also Islamic Jihad. I understand why Egypt does not want these people in their country. This is a difficult pill to swallow, and I think that this response was understandable. The problem is no one has come up with a solution for who and what will rule Gaza if a peace plan is successful. And this is Trump's opening gambit. We'll see where it goes.
We've heard quite a bit from other US allies. The Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, who was actually present at the inauguration. I think she can be considered a close ally and friend of this new administration. She's obviously not sounding too keen on this idea of resettling Palestinians from Gaza. She used the example of Syrian refugees being resettled in other countries in the region and how it had been unsettling and it had affected regional stability. I mean, do you think that's a consideration for the Trump team to bear in mind?
I think the Trump team will bear in mind every consideration, but I'll repeat to what I said earlier. There's no easy solution to what's going on in Gaza. The position of Israeli leaders, and I spoke to them a few months ago, is that before they will agree to a two-state solution, the Palestinians have to be de-radicalized. If we have a people that's training their young people from the time they're toddlers to destroy the state of Israel and to hate Jews, something has to change before that people is given an opportunity to set up a state next to Israel, which Hamas would use to rearm and attack Israel again.
So what you're saying is that the two-state solution, which has been talked about and championed as the only solution, including by some, I should add, in the Israeli government, not all of them are aligned on what the right outcome is. Are you saying that Washington's approach is that perhaps that solution is not the right solution and we're going to see something different? Is that your forecast?
I think I've already said that quite clearly. But, the focus for Trump is to be working with our allies in the region, our close friends like Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states, and Egypt, to see what can be done to expand the Abraham Accords and to create economic and political opportunities that's going to advance the interests of all these nations. There'll be a solution that he's going to pursue with the Palestinians, but the Palestinian issue should not obstruct other efforts to promote stability and the economic success of other nations in the region.
We're just under a week into this second Trump presidency, and countries like China, Mexico, Canada, Europe, all targeted in some way by some rhetoric out of Washington or threatened with tariffs. Colombia, too, is one of America's oldest allies in Latin America. Is there any sense of nervousness, do you think, in Washington, that perhaps some traditional allies might start to get a bit fed up and turn their backs on Washington?
Well, Colombia was very interesting because the Colombian president said he would not accept U.S. planes bringing dangerous illegal migrants to Colombia. When Trump threatened Colombia with tariffs, the Colombian president changed his mind and said, well, I'll send a presidential plane to take those illegal migrants back to Colombia. This was a success for Trump. It's not a big success, but it shows he can get things done. And I think that's what's dominating the news in the U.S. Not everyone agrees with Trump. They may not agree with everything he's saying, but he's doing something, and he's showing that there's a way for an American president to be successful on the global stage. And I think in the Middle East, especially Trump's relationship with Saudi Arabia, it's going to be a powerful and successful relationship.
So to sum everything up, I mean, it seems to me like you're saying that you've got some very old problems, some of them dating back several decades. Old solutions for those old problems haven't worked. Donald Trump's got some new solutions, and let's see whether or not they work. Is that sort of roughly the essence? Does that sort of sum up Donald Trump's approach to some of these old problems?
That is his approach, and it was his approach in the first term. And remember, the basis of the Abraham Accords was they offered the Palestinians the deal of the century. The Palestinians turned it down, an enormous offer, which would have sent billions of dollars of development aid into Gaza. The Palestinians, once again, turned in an opportunity for peace. Trump then went to our allies in the region and said, The Palestinians can't have a veto over proposals to stabilize and promote peace and economic security in the region. And the Trump administration found nations who agreed. We want to work with the Palestinians, but if they won't deal, if they simply want to obstruct, it's time to move on.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Fred Fleitz. Great to speak to you.
Okay, good to be here. Thank you.
Now, in other news, the US President Donald Trump has received some criticism for his decision to pardon the nearly 1,600 people convicted for their varying roles in the 6th of January attacks on the US Capitol. Well, one of those criticizing this decision is the Senator Lindsey Graham, a longtime ally of President Trump, who said that the move could send out the wrong signal. Well, some of those who received pardon included people who assaulted police officers during the course of the riots. Well, for more, we can speak now to Pam Hemphill, the so-called former MAGA granny, who has actually refused President Trump's pardon. Pam, you join us from Idaho. Great to have you with us. Let me just ask you, first of all, why did you refuse the pardon?
Well, I've been speaking out against Trump for about a year and a half, and I already said I wouldn't take a pardon if he ever offered one. But mainly it's because it would be a slap in the face to the police officers, to our rule of law, to our nation. It was an insurrection that day. I was part of that. I pleaded guilty because I was guilty, and I need to finish my sentence. It's part of my amends forever being there that day.
In legal terms, what's that therefore meant for you, refusing a pardon?
Well, I just have to complete my probation, and that's about it for me right now.
Sounds like you're you're extremely remorseful and regretful of having been there in the first place.
Oh, yeah, not knowing that it was a big lie, that the election had not been stolen. People around Trump told him it wasn't stolen. He went out there and lied about it anyway. And then I end up in prison, relying on him and all his enablers, believing that they're out there telling us the truth and they're lying. And so I pay a heavy price for it.
Must have been really hard going to prison. I won't reveal your age on air, but it's hard to go to prison at any age. But how did you manage?
Oh, it was very difficult. I just heard, though, that Joseph Biden pardoned the lady, Michelle West, that was there. And if it weren't for her, I wouldn't be here. She said she really helped make sure I was safe in prison.
How did she do that?
By telling the other girls to leave me alone. She kind of had some clout. She was a beautiful black Muslim lady. She would come over and say, "That's her channel. Give her back that TV button." She would just keep an eye on me because there were 95% cartel women in there, and they did not like Trump. And so they wanted to try to plant drugs in my room, and I could end up with another 4-year sentence, so she just made sure they knew to leave me alone.
Do you think any of the pardons that were issued were justified?
Oh, absolutely not. Not one. We broke the law that day. The Capitol was closed down to the public. No, this is gaslighting. They're trying to stay the victim. They're not a victim. They had a choice that day. They were volunteers.
Yeah, you've used this word gaslighting before. You've talked about a false narrative that surrounds what happened on the 6th of January. And there are people out there saying that there are attempts to kind of rewrite the history of the 6th of January. It sounds like you agree with that assessment. Who's rewriting it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We got eyes. We see the videos. How could you even think that it was peaceful? But they got to keep Trump's narrative going. And Trump's narrative is the DOJ is weaponized against him, which is not true. That's why I got upset and started speaking out, because they were using me to say the DOJ was weaponized against me. And I said, no, they're not. I pleaded guilty because I was guilty and I got due process. They go out there lying, saying they're not getting due process. And that's not true. You can just look up their court recordings. Every one of them are getting due process. Everything they put out there has been just an outright lie.
a lot of what you're telling me, and also the labels that are attached to you, describing you as a former Trump supporter, suggests that you've stopped supporting Donald Trump, perhaps some time ago. Why did you do that?
Oh, because I found out he was a dangerous narcissist. He's a cult leader. You know, in fact, when he was just recently sworn in, it felt like we were swearing in a dictator or a mob boss, you know, not a president. Yeah, it just so many reasons. But I voted for Harris, and I've changed my party to Democrat.
So all of this said, what were you doing on the 6th of January? Why were you even in that neck of the woods?
Well, I had been diagnosed with breast cancer, and my family called me up and said, how would you like to go there? Because I videotape in Boise, Idaho, a lot of events. I'm not a citizen journalist, but I enjoy videotaping. So they gave me the trip as a Christmas gift, and I went there, and I got there too late. And I'm walking around, and I'm going, what's going on next? Because I couldn't hear Trump. They said Trump's going down to the Capitol. So I thought, oh, I'll get there first. And but I went because I was kind of believing that the election had been stolen at that time.
And how did everything catch up with you? How did you get caught?
Well, when I was walking up to the Capitol, I ran into the Proud Boys, and I followed them for a while. But I was there's little bike racks, and William Dunphy started pushing on them, and they started pushing on the officers. I thought they were trying to get in too early. So an officer pulls me over, and I go walking around saying, it's your house, come on in. And that's why I got in trouble. Plus I was shoved inside the Capitol. So I was trespassing. I was charged with picketing and parading. I was guilty.
I mean, you sound so rational, and you're telling it in such a fair way, because you're saying exactly what you did, and you think you've been dealt fair justice by the justice system. I mean, what was going through your mind on the 6th of January 2021?
Just nothing really. I just wanted to hear the speakers, and hopefully I was hoping to go make it a vacation and see the White House. And I didn't even know the transfer of power was happening, but I was just overwhelmed with, it was such a large group of people. It was exciting. It was like going to Disneyland, you know.
Do you feel like you perhaps
first.
did you get a bit whipped up by the frenzy of it all, would you say?
Yeah, you feel like you're in a community of people that all are feeling the same, but you don't know about the disinformation warfare that was going on. I had no clue. You lose your critical thinking. You're listening to people with 2 PhDs, you know, Giuliani, all the people that surrounded Trump. Why would they be lying? They wouldn't be lying to the whole nation that the election was stolen, right? It doesn't come to you. But with Trump's gaslighting, when he says, they're coming after me, but they're really coming after you, it scares people. And then all the propaganda that the Democrats wanted to turn this into a communist nation, that scares you. And then a layperson like me does not do any research. So I'm really upset at myself for just trusting people. But now I have found out that everything Trump has put out there is an absolute lie. Absolute.
I mean, clearly everyone was whipped up into a frenzy on the 6th of January. Perhaps there were other people like you who hadn't got a track record of attending events like that and getting involved in that sort of thing. Where do you think the rallying cry came from? Who motivated people to show up on the 6th of January and essentially invade the Capitol building?
What Trump did. I believe Trump had the plan, along with his Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and all the people around him. I think there was a plan ahead of time. And like he said, it's going to be wild, right? You know, so I think it started with Trump. And as I believe, he's a dictator, and he's waited 3 hours, and we all know that, to do something. I mean, I was thinking, why isn't he up here stopping this? Why isn't he saying something? Why did he wait 3 hours if he didn't like what was going on?
And did you go inside the Capitol building, or did you never get that close? Because you mentioned that you got stopped by police quite early on. Did you go inside?
Well, no, after the police officers, because I told them I had stitches, said to go to the steps. So I got to the steps, but they shoved me down. They broke my glasses, stepped on my head, cut my knee. Yeah, I was a mess. I was a mess. The officers picked me up and saved my life that day, but I hung around, and that's where I was wrong. To videotape, I got in front of the door, and everybody starts shoving everybody in. So I sat down, and the Capitol police officer helped me get out. Because I said, I can't get around this crowd. They're crazy. They're pushing people like me down. So it was horrifying. The whole day was just a nightmare.
But I don't really understand why you're admitting so much guilt, because from what you're telling me, and you're being very honest and very frank, so I've got no reason to doubt what you're telling me, but you were there filming something that was happening, something important, and you didn't really have a prior motivation. You just found yourself sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time. So why do you think you're so guilty?
Because I had a choice. I'm not a victim of January 6th. I stayed. I could have left, so I broke the law. It's really that simple. The Capitol was not open to anybody, and anybody else trying to excuse what they did that day and blame the Capitol police officers and blame somebody else, the government. It's all, they're in denial. They don't want to face the consequences of what they did that day. So I'm not going to be a part of that. I have to work a spiritual program. I've been sober for 45 years now. I had to admit when I was wrong, and I was wrong that day. I was 100% wrong. Shouldn't have been there. It's the worst day of my life that I got to live with, that I was a part of that.
Okay, just lastly, Pam, I have to ask you, they call you in the media the former MAGA granny, and I just want to ask you how you feel about that label.
Well, I leave the name because people, Tucker Carlson on Fox News had given me that name, so people know who I am, but I say ex-MAGA granny. So I don't know, we need a new name. Some people call me Pam Tifa now.
All right, well, I'll call you Pam Hemphill because that is your name. And I'd like to say a very big thank you to you for speaking to us on Al Arabiya News.
Thank you.
Okay, for more, we can speak now to Brandon Straka, who was one of the people who received a pardon from President Trump for his role on the 6th of January. He joins us now from New York. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Brandon. I just want to ask you, first of all, how did you feel when you first heard you'd been pardoned?
Oh, I felt overjoyed. I felt relieved. I mean, for me, I'd say the number one thing that made me feel relieved was that the pardon sort of unburdened me from being locked into my plea deal, which was untrue from top to bottom. So essentially, it sort of negated my plea deal and allowed me the freedom and opportunity to say openly that the contents of my plea deal were a lie.
Okay, so what was it that, I mean, you'll just have to explain to our viewers, what was it about the plea deal that made you think it was worth signing?
Well, because I've always said, for me, it was never a question of how do I win and how do I lose. When you're going up against the federal government, you're only going to lose. So it becomes a question of how do you lose the least? How do you get through a situation like that with as much of your life intact as possible when you come out the other side? And for me, taking a plea deal was really the only option because the government has gotten a 100% conviction rate on January 6th cases because they will only allow the jurisdiction for the cases to be heard in Washington, D.C. So this is a district that has voted 93% against Donald Trump. These people hate Donald Trump. They hate his supporters. And now you've taken these people and put them basically in a trap in these courtrooms where the jurors and the judges who are deciding their fate hate them and have this idea in their head that these people are violent insurrectionists, white supremacists, and all these things that they've been told. So for me, when the government arrested me, put me in jail, FBI raided my house in the most absurd and ridiculous fashion, I was initially facing 2 felonies and a misdemeanor. Then they threatened to add a 3rd felony. Or they said I could take a plea deal and all the felonies go away if I pled guilty to a Class B misdemeanor and signed their statement of offense, which was thoroughly false from top to bottom.
Let's go back to that day, the 6th of January 2021, a day that I think None of us will forget, and I was covering the event, albeit from a news studio. What were you doing there in DC? You're normally based in Omaha, in Nebraska. You traveled 2,000 kilometers from Omaha to DC. What brought you there?
Well, normally I'm based out of New York City, and my time in Omaha was supposed to be temporary during the COVID pandemic. But I travel the country regularly. I've been doing this for now almost 7 years, leading a social political movement that I call #WalkAway campaign. We're the largest national movement of former Democrats walking away from the Democratic Party. And I was asked to be a speaker at a scheduled permitted event on Capitol grounds that day. So it was always supposed to be a march from the ellipse to the Capitol, where there was a second stage with a permitted event. I was one of dozens of speakers scheduled to speak. And when I was arriving for my scheduled speaking engagement, I started getting messages on my phone telling me that from people who are watching on television around the country, saying, we're hearing that something is happening and that people are going inside the building. And so I started shooting a video, and I approached the Capitol from the east side, walked up to the building. Now, this is usually the point where most media stations start showing footage of the west side of the building and all the violence that was taking place. That was not my experience on the east side. If you actually watch my video and show my footage, what you'll see is thousands of people very calmly, peacefully standing outside of the Capitol. The barricades were fully open. There were no signs indicating people weren't allowed to be there. There were no police officers on the east side of the building telling people to leave or struggling with people. It was just a crowd of people standing outside of the building. And as I got close to the building, there was a man at the top of the steps who was shouting, "They've opened the doors. They're letting us in. We're going inside. We're going inside." So I walked up to the top of the east side of the steps. And when I got there, sure enough, the doors on the east side of the Capitol were open. There was a crowd of several hundred people at the top of the steps. Some of them were trying to push their way in. The majority, like me, were just standing outside shooting a video. So I never entered the Capitol on January 6th, never went inside. I didn't engage in any violence, vandalism, theft, or destruction. I didn't witness any violence, vandalism, theft, or destruction. What I witnessed was a crowd of people that perhaps at best one could describe as disorderly, some of them trying to push their way in. But after 8 minutes, a man came out of the building, got on a bullhorn, and said, "They've cleared Congress, everyone left the building, move out." And I immediately turned around and walked down the stairs. And then I uploaded that video to Twitter. And 2.5 weeks later, the FBI raided my home and took me to jail.
I mean, from what you've sort of told us there, I mean, it doesn't sound like you did very much apart from stand there and film something, which...
I don't think I did anything.
Right, and filming something is allowed. So in your case, you didn't hurt anybody, you weren't an accessory to any violence, you didn't vandalize anything, you didn't steal anything. That's your case. What about some of the other cases where we did see people do those things? Do you think...
Well, let me say...
Do you think Donald Trump was right to pardon them?
I do, but before I answer that question, let me please say too, what I just described to you is an accurate depiction of my experience at the Capitol. However, when it came time for me to go to jail and be charged with felonies and end up taking a plea deal, because I didn't actually do anything, the FBI had to create a story that I did. And the best story that they could come up with was that I stood outside of the building shouting, "Go, go, go," to encourage people to enter the building. And that I stood outside of the building shouting, take it," to encourage the crowd of people to take a shield from an officer. I did not do these things. That was never true. However, it was a condition of my plea deal that I signed their statement of offense that said I did those things. So you will read that I confessed to doing those things. I want to say unequivocally, I did not do those things. They never happened. Nonetheless, it was a required part of my plea agreement to say that I did. And to answer your question about the others, I'll first of all say I don't condone violence. I don't condone destruction or vandalism. And I don't think that those things are okay. However, if you look historically, even over the last 10 years in the United States, we have seen numerous protests, even protest movements like the Black Lives Matter movement that went on and on and on for months, in which there was unbelievable violence and vandalism and destruction and harming of police officers to the point of people got killed. I mean, police officers were murdered in 2020. And none of these rioters in that instance or many others ever faced consequences like the January 6th defendants faced. And it wasn't just judicial consequences. Every single person, including myself, including people who weren't even accused of violence or destruction, we were all placed on terrorism watch lists. We were all placed on the TSA Quad S list, meaning we weren't able to get on an airplane without going through hours of screening. And then when we did get on the airplane, we were accompanied by armed air marshals. We were all permanently banned by banks, payment processors, email services, social media, and had our names and reputations destroyed in the media, referred to as violent insurrectionists, anarchists, white supremacists, and people who tried to overthrow the government. So when I look at what happened on that day, including things I don't approve of, like breaking windows or initiating violence with police officers, because many people were accused of violence who were only finding themselves in a defensive posture, I look at that and I say, I think that 4 years in prison and all of the collateral consequences that come with being associated with January 6th are more than enough, especially when you consider that this is the exact same behavior that other groups of people have engaged in our country in the past, and they faced no consequences whatsoever. I think 4 years in federal prison and all of these consequences is more than enough for what happened on that day.
I mean, I think someone watching will say, okay, your situation is a little bit different from some of the other situations. I mean, it sounds to me like you were in the wrong place at very much the wrong time. And again, I was thinking to myself as you were telling me that, I mean, if there was no evidence of you doing the things you were accused of doing, and there were so many cameras there that day, the idea that you were shouting, go, 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 and all the rest of it, I mean, if there was no evidence of it, it does seem like an incredibly difficult charge for them to have attached to you. But that to one side, I mean, there's a huge symbolism, isn't there, to attacking the seat of democracy in the country that, you know, carries the flag for democracy and freedom for the rest of the world. And therefore, perhaps shouldn't it be surprising that the full weight of the law came down on anyone with literally any association with that day?
Well, I would argue with the premise that it was an attack on democracy or an attack on the seat of democracy. People went to January 6th because they wanted to protest an election that they believed that there was sufficient enough evidence to believe that it was not an authentic, valid election. And people wanted a forensic audit of the vote. I mean, that is the threat to democracy. When people can't believe in elections anymore, and not only can't believe in elections, but aren't even being given the sufficient evidence that they're asking for to be shown that there wasn't significant fraud in the election that would sway the outcome, that's the threat to democracy. And that's what got people so upset. And they went to January 6th to protest that. And when they got there, a number of things went wrong, including police officers shooting flashbangs at people who were standing peacefully, or shooting people in the face with rubber bullets, pushing people and hitting people with batons and tear gassing people. There was a lot of activity from the Capitol Police that agitated the crowd a lot before the crowd became so unruly that they started knocking down barricades and violence ensued. So the idea that there was this like preconceived plan to go to Washington, D.C. and try to overthrow the government with zip ties and pepper spray is a little over the top, I think. And I think that that people are really becoming hyperbolic about the narrative of what happened and why.
Yeah, it's really interesting because just before we spoke to you, Brandon, we were talking to Pam Hemphill, also known as the former MAGA granny, a label that was attached to her by Fox News. She has not accepted the pardon because she says, I was wrong, I deserve to be punished, I paid the price, and I don't want a pardon, and I don't want anything more to do with President Donald Trump and his party. What's your reaction when you hear someone like that saying those sorts of things?
Yeah, well, the media should really investigate Pam Hemphill and what she's really about. So I had the opportunity to interview Pam only a month or two ago, and I asked her several questions about the assertions she's been making about pleading guilty because she is guilty and refusing a plea deal. And I asked Pam, Pam, if you pled guilty because you actually believe you're guilty, why did you take a plea deal? Because you were charged initially with 4 or 5 different counts of committing crimes. And Pam is on camera on January 6th, encouraging people to go in the building, telling people, go in there, this is your house, this is your house. Well, she didn't plead guilty to the many charges that came against her. She took the easy way out by taking a plea deal. And then when I asked her, well, so was the government lying in those other charges that you didn't plead guilty to? And she said, well, I'm not really sure if they were lying or not. And I said, well, that's interesting, because you keep telling everyone that the government didn't act corruptly on January 6th, that everybody who was charged because they were guilty. And yet she didn't actually plead guilty to the things that she was accused of. She took a plea deal to get out of the situation, just like so many other people did. But the really interesting thing about Pam is that she was really enjoying the attention she was receiving from being a conservative cable news personality when she was the MAGA granny. But as happens in any situation, the media cycle changes and people lose interest and they move on. When the conservative media lost interest in Pam, that's when all of a sudden Pam flipped and turned on Trump and turned on Pam was out there crusading for the Proud Boys. She was every single day. She was trying to be an advocate for the Proud Boys and say that the Proud Boys were being wronged until people stopped paying attention to her. And then the moment that she flipped, CNN started having her on all the time. The left-wing media took interest in her. And now Pam's all in against Trump and all in against the January 6ers. I promise you, when the left-wing media loses interest in Pam, she'll flip her story again. That's who Pam is.
Okay, well, of course, Pam isn't with us at this moment to answer to any of those comments. I just want to ask you lastly, Brandon, you're the founder of the Walk Away campaign. You've mentioned it already in this interview. It obviously encourages people to walk away from and abandon the Democratic Party. How do you feel to have President Trump back in the White House?
I think, like so many people, we're feeling like it's a new dawn, it's a new day, that, you know, America is finally under the watch of a president that actually cares about putting the American people first, putting our economy first, making America truly great again. And he has been on fire in just the first week in office. An unbelievable amount of executive orders, and including a lot of border security, which is so important to so many people. The deportations, which is really important to a lot of people, and keeping his promise to the J6ers and initiating a body to investigate January 6th, a new committee. I think that people are feeling relieved once again. And I truly believe that America is about to enter a new golden age under President Trump. And I'll say one more thing too. Not only do I believe we're about to enter into a new golden age under President Trump, but I think that all of the resistance that we saw in his first term, I think it's going to begin to erode and chip away, because more and more people every day are realizing that they can't trust the mainstream media, that they've been lied to, and everything that they've been told about Donald Trump in an effort to control the way that they think and the way they feel and the way that they vote. People are getting wise to what the media has done to manipulate them. And I think that there is a great opportunity here for the next 4 years to be 4 years of great unification in our country and a lot of patriotism and rallying behind this great new America that's being created under Donald Trump.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for your time, Brendan Strack. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, less than a week into President Donald Trump's second administration, he has once again declared that he is, quote, taking back the Panama Canal, and that's sparking fears that he might attempt to do so by military force. Well, President Trump claims that China is operating the canal, but employees there insist that it is 100% run by Panamanians. Well, for more, we can speak now to Barbara Stephenson, former U.S. ambassador to Panama under President Barack Obama, who joins us now from North Carolina. Ambassador, great to have you with us. I should add, you also served as U.S. ambassador to London. Now, of course, today we're going to be talking about events in Panama specifically. Is Donald Trump serious about taking back control of the Panama Canal?
There's a bee in his bonnet. I think we can all see that. Now, exactly what he is on about and what he plans to do, I think, is a subject of a lot of discussion in Washington and certainly in our hemisphere. You know, I can certainly imagine a shipper of liquefied natural gas, which goes from our Gulf ports through the Panama Canal to Asia in about the course of a month, being alarmed in the 2023 and 2024 when the shipping tolls went up dramatically. And the answer to why that happened is that there was a severe drought in Panama, and it's not a flat canal like Suez. It's a canal where the ships have to be lifted through locks with fresh water, taken across the high part of the middle of the country, drop down, and then that fresh water goes out to the ocean with each passage. So it uses a lot of water to transit the ships through. And normally about 32 ships go through a day, but 36, 38, but it dropped to 22 back during the drought. And so on top of the tolls, there was an auction system to auction off the remaining slots, and that caused tolls to go up, doubling and even more. So did someone get the president's ear and say we're being price gouged on shipping LNG through the canal? That's a possibility. Another possibility I was reminded of by Fareed Zakaria, host of Global Public Square on CNN yesterday morning. He reminded us that when President Trump visited Panama in 2017 and met with then President Juan Carlos Varela, that he raised with him then that he didn't believe that the U.S. Navy should have to pay a toll to go through the Panama Canal. The whole not a high toll, it's a reduced toll. U.S. ships get, front of the line privileges. But the president was arguing, we're paying too much. It was a total of $1 million a year for all of our Navy ships. So it could be, he's a deal maker. So exactly what is in there is still being sorted out. There's a third part to this that I want to add. The canal is not controlled by the Chinese. It is controlled by the Panama Canal Authority. The ports and the other infrastructure around the canal, the Pacific end, the Atlantic end, three other pieces of critical infrastructure, they are in Chinese hands. And we now, years after international bidding processes to let these go, in which the U.S. lost out to the Chinese state-owned enterprises in certainly the Panama on the Pacific coast, we see that this does give China leverage, and it does have some national security significance. That same president, Juan Carlos Varela, in 2017, surprised U.S. officials, including my successor, Ambassador John Feely, with 1 hour's notice that instead of recognizing Taiwan, Panama was going to recognize China. So not the canal itself, but that infrastructure has been raised as an issue. And so there might very well be something there that needs to be looked at.
Okay, Ambassador, you raised lots of important points. I'll try to pick up all of them. Firstly, concerns about, therefore, Chinese influence near the waterway. You're saying that they're not entirely without justification.
So the Commander-in-Chief of Southern Command, which oversees, that's her part of the world, she testified to Congress in 2023 that these 5 pieces of critical infrastructure were cause for concern. So that's not a new idea. And there is a generalized concern that actually President Trump's new national security advisor, Mike Waltz, spoke about, which is China's growing influence throughout Latin America. And he stated an intent of the Trump administration to really pay more attention to Latin America in order to counter this rising Chinese influence. But let's be clear, it is not a surprise that China, which runs its economy on exports, has made a worldwide investment in port infrastructure. It's Peru, it's Panama, it's Piraeus, and it's all kinds of other places that don't start with a P. But we've been following this in the Belt and Road Initiative for some years. Panama is an instant case of how China with state-owned enterprises outbids often.
Okay, so one of the things you said in your opening statement is that this could all be a negotiating tactic, or you alluded to the fact that, as some analysts are suggesting, this could be President Trump's negotiating a technique to bring people to the table, to start the discussion, to put the idea out there. You also mentioned the former US ambassador to Panama, John Feely. And one of the things he's been saying is that it would, quote, take military force to take back control of the Panama Canal. I mean, I don't know if you agree with that. And I just want to ask, could it really come to that?
So I don't see a scenario in which Panama would, quote, give back the canal. I just do not. It is an issue of paramount importance to the Panamanians. Sovereignty over the canal is a deeply held conviction in Panamanians' hearts. But I'm going to draw a contrast. When I went down as ambassador, I remember in my Senate confirmation hearing citing America's approval rating in Panama. 84% of Panamanians had a positive impression of the United States. And it's still one of the places where there's the most pro-American sentiment. And if one of the goals of the administration is to help counter Chinese sway and reestablish America in, the hearts, minds, and business practices of our neighbors to the south, this is costly. I guess that's one of the things I would say. Now, would it take military force? I can't see another way. It depends on whether the president really wants to control the Panama Canal, or whether he's after something else. He does need Panama to really play ball the way Mexico has and help with the migrant flow, which comes through Panama through the Darien Gap. It's hard to say whether there's an ulterior motive. There does seem to be a very real recurring theme in the president's mind that we pay too much to transit the canal. Now, the drought is over, transits are up to normal, the auction process has been, put to the side. So, that part of paying a lot has really, it's not an ongoing issue. We don't know, I think, precisely what the president is after, and his aims in some ways seem not all pointing in the same direction.
Okay, so maybe there will be some preferential rates given to the United States. I don't know if you think that's a possible outcome of all of this, or whether you think perhaps already, now that that bidding process for transit in the Panama Canal has ended, that President Trump has got something to show the American people and say, well, in fact, we were being ripped off, but we're not anymore. Could that be something he then shows to the American people?
I think a very good staffer could give him those points and they would then look valid when you went to the business pages, but without knowing quite what he's after, because as you know, if you read that part of the speech, it was a sweeping President McKinley, homage, and it was about, it's still kind of hard to say as an American diplomat because we haven't talked about this since I was a school child, but it was a manifest destiny expanding empire speech. It's not just Panama, it's also Greenland. There's other, and then, planting the flag on Mars, which is, a kind of a John F. Kennedy idea. So we were in new space. We have not really talked about territorial acquisition as a goal in such a long time that you have to reach way back into a previous century to find precedents for us speaking this way. That is a possible aspiration. I don't think we know fully. But I think I agree with John. It is hard to imagine. So can a deal be made short of military force? Yes. Do we really intend to take back the Panama Canal? I'm sorry I brought it back up again because I find it to be a topic that's unhelpful to discuss for America's larger interests, given, flags have been burned at the U.S. Embassy and at the ambassador's residence, the kind of thing that just hasn't happened in a long time. So it has definitely provoked a very negative reaction among Panamanians. And it is worth remembering that when the U.S. Negotiated the Panama Canal treaties in 1977, a major reason for doing that was that our Department of Defense had concluded that opposition, not only in Panama, but really throughout the hemisphere, was so strong to the U.S. having this colonial presence in Panama that the canal was almost indefensible under U.S. ownership. If the U.S. had our flag over it. Panama, though, doesn't really have many enemies. They make it a point not to be that kind of a country. They survive. Their whole economic model is because people pass through there. So it became not a military challenge. But when the U.S. is actually in charge of it, when we were in charge of it in the 70s, the Pentagon had concluded it was largely indefensible with an American flag flying over it.
Yeah, and of course, debate about the Panama Canal and its return to Panama, obviously reignited by the passing of President Jimmy Carter last month. And I just want to ask you, I mean, you first served in Panama right at the beginning of your career in the mid-1980s. I mean, did you imagine that here we'd be 40 years later discussing whether or not control of the Panama Canal should be taken back by Washington?
So when I went there in 1986 and I served on the Joint Commission on the Environment, which was to keep the watershed healthy so there'd be plenty of water and no silting up, the U.S. and Panama were in a prolonged process that went from 1977 to the end of 1999 of building up Panamanian management and then leadership of the canal for a handoff. And the raw feelings from the vote on the Panama Canal Treaty, which was close, it was just a vote or two in favor. Many of the people who voted for it were never elected to any office again because the opposition was so strong. It wasn't that hard to imagine that this was going to remain a contentious political issue for the United States back in the mid-'80s. But by the time we get to now, it's been like right at 25 years since Panama has taken over running the canal. It's run smoothly. I remember in my opening remarks when I arrived in Panama, I said, no, it doesn't matter how you measure it. What you guys have done with the canal has been a big success, whether it's number of transits, transit times, the safety record, they were all a really improved record. But what Panama did that the U.S. didn't do, when the U.S. ran it, we ran it as a utility on a break-even basis. Panama funds 25-30% of its budget from the government budget from canal tolls. So the cost of a transit went up, but it's not in Panama's interest, having invested more than $5 billion in these big new locks that take the much larger vessels through. It's not in their interest to charge so much that shippers decide to choose another route. They need it to hit that point where this is the most cost-effective way to get your goods delivered. So I think in the long run, we've got a drought that ended. We've got Panamanians looking at an additional water reservoir to add in case there's drought again. The tolls have gone down. The U.S. Navy ships get preferential treatment. Would Panama agree to even more preferential treatment? I don't know. But it's, I think we will come to something far short of military force.
Okay, so we talked about how... Okay, we've talked about how some optimistic analysts are saying that perhaps this is all a negotiating tactic and it might even end up having the effect of strengthening U.S.-Panamanian ties. There are also some cynics out there. Senator Chris Murphy calling the seizure of Greenland and taking back control of the Panama Canal as being a distraction from bigger issues like inflation. He called this, quote, catnip. I wonder if you agree with his assessment.
I do think this is a crowd pleaser for the Republican base. Giving back the canal was a very contentious issue. I have a wonderful book called Drawing the Line at the Big Ditch, and it just details the political cost. And Republicans, this was done by a Democratic president who's just been rehabilitated. And really seen as one of our great presidents in the long run. And, for night after night, we did watch the footage of President Carter signing the agreement with, President Torrijos to hand it over. So it is a bit of catnip and it is a bit of a distraction. And I think Chris Murphy's a really smart guy. I'm going to entertain his theory.
I'd just like to ask you about U.S. foreign policy and how it's shaping up under President Trump overall. We've got Secretary of State Marco Rubio making his first visit in his new capacity to Central America. He's going to be going to a number of places, including Panama. And he is, of course, the first Hispanic and first fluent Spanish speaker in that particular role. What sort of a welcome do you think they're likely to give him at this stage? I mean, this trip could happen as soon as next week or this coming week. What sort of a welcome do you think he'll get there in Panama?
So, It's a really exceptional relationship the U.S. has with Panama, and we often used family terms to describe it. And the Panamanians used to say, you know, with this relationship, no hay divorcio. You know, you can never be divorced. And then, you know, as time went on, we did sort of leave, but it tends to be both very close and familial, but then big blazing rows sometimes. And we feel like we might be in a big blazing row moment with this, these repeated statements from the president that, you know, Panama is not running the canal, the Chinese are. So it could be a rocky visit.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, of course, President Jose Raul Molino is a big, strong U.S. ally. I mean, a staunch ally, and as you say, the whole country's been allied to the United States and looked at in sort of familial terms. But I mean, do you think there is a danger here? The United States has been, under Donald Trump, stoking a couple of strong allies. This isn't the first such example. I mean, do you think there's a danger that the United States is really going to get a lot of backs up unnecessarily on the international stage?
I am really worried about that, and I wanted to be positive in this interview, but after Colombia, which has routinely been accepting deportation flights, rejected military flights with Colombians handcuffed on the flight and said, you know, we want them delivered on a civilian plane, we'll give you one. We've had quite the morning here of closing the visa section in the embassy in Bogota, and imposition, or the announcement of imposition of 25% tariffs with Colombia, which is a country we have a free trade agreement with, as we do with Panama. So it's been a rocky time, and I can't quite see the logic of this. I really want to come back to what the National Security Advisor talked about, which is that, you know, he said the president is very focused on the Western Hemisphere these days. And so some of these things that I've done on for multiple administrations, but he talked about, you know, looking at the Western Hemisphere really as a source of energy, critical minerals, the food supply we absolutely need. So partnership is kind of what we were after when I was there. That was actually our official talking points, from paternalism to partnership. And it's languished. It's languished, and China has actually very much grown in sway in Latin America. I think that part is absolutely indisputable. How we win Latin America back, I am one who believes that wolf warrior diplomacy has cost China dearly. And I just don't think that the U.S. adopting that posture with Latin America is likely to play out any differently.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Ambassador Barbara Stephenson, thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.